Well, The Case for Christ is the film adaptation of Lee Strobel's book of the same name, which came out many years ago and has been a big hit in evangelical circles and beyond. The story is kind of fascinating. It's about this young, go-getter, ambitious, and atheist reporter for the Chicago Tribune. And his wife discovers the Christian faith. And it throws Lee Strobel completely for a loop because this is not his thing. He's an atheist. He doesn't understand it. He feels that it's a kind of betrayal of him. And I found that interesting because I actually worked over the years with some couples in that situation. You know, one's a believer, one's an atheist, a non-believer. In some cases, the non-believer says, oh, well, that's kind of a harmless little hobby you have. But in other cases, it's a real challenge to the marriage because the ultimate values are just different. And the Lee Strobel case is very much that second type. I mean, it caused a major crisis in his marriage. Well, he's a reporter, right? A man of the facts. He's analytical. And he decides, I'm going to debunk this thing. I'm going to show my wife that this Christianity thing is for the birds, right? And so he sets out with all his reporter skills to do just that. At the prompting of one of his colleagues, who's a Christian, he said, well, what should I investigate? And the guy says, well, it all rests really on the resurrection. If there's no resurrection, the thing falls apart like a house of cards. So Strobel says, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to investigate the truth of the resurrection. Well, right away, there are a couple things about that I really liked. First of all, Christianity, at its best, is not fideistic. What I mean is, it doesn't rely simply on faith in an uncritical way. It's open to the investigation of reason. It's open to the contribution of reason. And so someone asking good, hard questions, yeah, okay by me. Secondly, Christianity is an historical religion, stubbornly so. It's based upon very historical claims about this particular Jesus and the remarkable claim that he rose bodily from the dead. Now, there are a lot of attempts over the centuries and certainly in recent years to present Christianity as basically a philosophy. It's a spirituality. Sure, it goes back to Jesus, but he's kind of a long forgotten figure, and it's really what matters is his teaching, and he's a great moral exemplar. Well, that ain't it. I mean, that's just not classical Christianity. Strobel's colleague is right. It's based on this historical claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and if there's nothing to that claim, finally there's nothing to Christianity. So actually, I found it kind of bracing as this guy sets out, all right, I'm going to do the investigation. See, because an honest Christian knows that it's a fair question and something is really at stake. And so it gives it kind of a thrilling quality. And in fact, the movie to me was a bit like a detective story, watching a detective hunt down the clues, Okay. So what were the questions that he pursued? I mean, what were the objections he was trying to look into? Well, the first one, look, isn't Christianity and this claim of resurrection just a kind of pious fairy tale? It's a story made up by people long ago who were afraid of death, or they wanted to get a following or whatever. They made up these nice stories. Well, as Strobel follows that line, he runs up against the counter evidence that no, lots of people in the first century claimed that they saw Jesus after he died. In one case, Paul says 500 people saw him at once. Is it likely that a made-up story, just a legendary account, would be so attested to, even to the point of death? Because let's face it, say what you want, most of the early Christian witnesses went to their deaths defending this claim. I mean, would someone do that for a pious legend that they made up? Just a nice story? So that struck him as interesting, as important. Second line of criticism, look, isn't this thing just a case of mass hallucination? I mean, let's give them benefit of the doubt that these were honest people. They were reporting something that they saw, but people have hallucinations, and this was maybe just a mass hallucination. Well, in pursuing that one, he goes to talk to a psychiatrist. And she says to him, well, she herself is a skeptic, by the way, which I thought was interesting. She goes, yeah, I'm a skeptic about religion, but to be honest with you, that's not a very credible theory. She said, it just doesn't work that way with waking dreams or hallucinations. And then she said, if 500 people simultaneously had the same hallucination, that would be more miraculous than the resurrection. And so he comes away from the psychiatrist with a sense of, well, okay, I guess that argument is not very good. Well, then he says, maybe these ancient texts aren't very reliable. So yeah, we have the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters, and they all attest to this resurrection. But, what do we know about these texts? And were they written many years or centuries later? Are they faithful to the original witness, etc.? So on the advice of a friend, he finds this Catholic priest who's also an archaeologist and a specialist in ancient manuscripts. And they've got a really interesting conversation. The priest patiently explains to him that among ancient texts, the New Testament ones are some of the best attested that we have. So, I mean, who doubts the legitimacy, let's say, of Plato's dialogues? I've got a copy up here on my shelf someplace that are based upon a whole manuscript tradition going back to, I don't know, maybe it's like the 7th or 8th century, or the earliest ones we've got. The earliest surviving manuscripts of Plato's dialogues are from that era. Or look at Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey. This expert tells him correctly that there's a handful of fragments floating around from the ancient world, but none of them as close to the original time as the gospel copies are. And in fact, we have a huge number of texts from periods quite close to the first century, early versions of the gospel. The point is more of a technical point, is the Gospels are by far the best attested manuscripts or texts we have in the ancient world. Well, there goes that theory. A final one he pursues, and again, he's kind of a dogged guy, and he's convinced all along this thing is not right. He pursues the so-called Swoon Theory. So the Swoon Theory says, okay, the texts are reliable. Okay, people really did see Jesus after he was crucified, but what they saw was a guy who survived the crucifixion and revived somehow in the tomb and then presented himself. So the Swoon Theory, which again, you see that up and down the centuries and in the recent years also being represented. So in pursuit of this, he comes to LA to talk to a well-known physician, medical expert. And he says, okay, I want you to give me the best read on the Swoon Theory about Jesus. And the guy says to him, honestly, the Swoon Theory is rubbish. And then he goes through the physiology of crucifixion. And of course, this is pretty well attested. What the Romans did to someone in the course of a crucifixion, what it involved medically in terms of blood loss, asphyxiation, et cetera, and then the fact that we know the Romans were especially good at putting people to death. He said, it is impossibly unlikely that someone would survive that kind of torture. I'm always struck too by, let's say someone did manage by some miracle to survive the ordeal of a crucifixion, and they came staggering out of the tomb. That's not what the first Christians are talking about. And you would never say, boy, oh boy, am I going to start a new religion based on that guy who basically needs emergency care, That's not the way a new religion begins. So the Swoon Theory is rubbish. Now, as I say, all this time, because it's not presented in a simplistic way, all this time, Strobel is, he's balking, he's questioning, he's wondering. His default position is that Christianity is bunk. But what's happening to him now as he moves along is gradually these arguments, these probabilities are accumulating in such a way that they're wearing down his resistance. And here I was reminded very much of John Henry Newman, where Newman said, in matters religious, we rarely come to assent because of one clinching argument. Rather, it's by a whole series of probable arguments, hunches, intuitions, experiences, witness of others, that we avail separately, but they come together to a common point. And it's that process, under the guidance of what Newman calls the illative sense, that the mind comes to assent. It says, yes. Well, this was happening to Lee Strobel. And there's a very interesting moment. When he's talking to the priest archaeologist, he sees a reproduction of the Shroud of Turin, so the famous, burial cloth of Jesus, purportedly the burial cloth of Jesus. And he looks into the face of the Shroud of Turin, and he just says to the priest, let's grant it's all true. Why would he have gone through that? Why would he have endured all of that? And the priest says, that's easy. Love. And that little line stayed in Strobel's mind. And at the end of the movie, as he's assessing all these arguments, as his tough reporter's mind is sifting through the data, that little insight comes back to him. And you get the impression that it was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the last bit that he needed to push his mind to assent. And so he does. He comes to faith. And it's part of the story that's very dramatic. And then Lee Strobel emerges as a great figure in the evangelical world. And now for the past 20-some years has been teacher, preacher, evangelist, Well, there's a lot about the movie that I admired, but I think especially the way it presented this slow, steady, often painful, stopping and starting process by which we come to faith. So I think anybody interested in the claims of Christianity, anybody with a tough mind about it, I think it's not a bad movie to watch.